the Motivational Mindset Podcast with Switch Motivation.
Hello and welcome to episode 3. My name's Rich Knight and this week I've been speaking to Sarah Furness, a former combat helicopter pilot and now keynote speaker and executive coach. Enjoy.
Hello everybody, my name is Sarah Furness. I think probably the most interesting thing about me is that I was a helicopter pilot in the Air Force for 21 years. That's usually what I start with, and then I left the RAF about 3 years ago to set up my own business, and I now do coaching workshops, but mostly keynote speaking, so kind of motivational type speaking, which I suppose motivational is in the title, so I should know something about it, shouldn't I? So yeah, why do I do what I do? That's a really good question, because it's sort of it might take the whole podcast to answer this, I think, because I've been thinking so much about this motivation thing, and it is quite hard to pinpoint, really. But I think the reason that I am now doing keynote speaking is because I realized that I could use all of my military experience to actually kind of my main mission when I left the Air Force was to cure the world of all suffering, because I discovered mindfulness, and I was going to be a mindfulness coach, and I was going to do all these retreats. But I realized quite early on that the reason that people were coming to me wasn't necessarily because of the mindfulness, it's because of the military stuff. And I realized I had a sort of fairly unique opportunity in a way to harness everything I'd learned in the military, but also harness mindfulness techniques. So I kind of refer to it as military grade mindfulness. But basically now I tell lots of stories, but I'm kind of weaving in mindfulness techniques at the time. So I'm sort of teaching it through self, through the medium of stories about crashing helicopters and all sorts of things. So it's kind of fun. And it means that I can reach people that I might not have been able to reach, who might have been closed-minded, or, you know, like me, thought that mindfulness wasn't for them. So that's really why I do what I do, is because I realized I had this golden opportunity to help people, I suppose.
Fantastic. Yeah, absolutely. And it's really interesting you mentioned crashing helicopters, which always sounds slightly scary, and we'll talk about that shortly if you don't mind, because I think people would like to hear a little bit more about that. But yeah, I think in terms of where we're going to go with our conversation today, that move from such different environments. It'd be really interesting to learn a little bit more about how that impacts the way you go about your motivational focus and all of that sort of thing, and how that may well change. I think that would be a really interesting one to think about. But just as a general understanding, and I know we've had a brief conversation before we're actually recording this podcast now, but from a motivation point of view, you know, what you mentioned you've been doing a lot of thinking about it. What does that actually, you know, what does that mean to you at this point in your life, in your career?
Yeah, and I would say that it has changed quite dramatically, you know, in the last probably 5 years. What motivates me today? It's funny. I think there is a generic theme throughout, but I think the question I ask myself is, who do I want to be? And I like that question because it doesn't just talk about the future. We often think of motivation, I think, as where do I want to be in the future? And, you know, I think like motivation, it means movement, I think. And so you've kind of got this idea you've got to be moving towards something. So I was thinking a lot about, do you need to have an end goal? Do you need to know where you're going to be motivated? And when I joined the Air Force, I was highly motivated towards an end goal, and that was to be, you know, Maverick. Basically, that's who I wanted to be. But it was still who I wanted to be, not what I wanted to do. And I think that's quite helpful. So these days, I don't think I've got such a narrow view of my end goal, and I think that's a good thing. I think it allows, you know, as you know, when you run a business, I think you've got to be agile and, you know, adapt, and you've got to be able to pivot. But I still think that central question is, who do I want to be? And really, I want to be someone who I like. You know, I want to be I don't mean being Mother Teresa. I just kind of don't want to be a total douchebag. You know, I want to be broadly, you know, better than I am, worse, and, you know, helping people more than I'm hindering them. And I've sort of found that keynote speaking allows me to kind of, it sounds really cliche, but, you know, I like who I am. I think I'm the best version of who I am, and I'm able to make a living out of it, and I'm able to help some people along the way. So it's like, who do I want to be? I just want to be someone that I like, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's something, we all share internally, that desire to be a good person, to do great things. And there are quite a few things that can get in the way around that from an external influence point of view. And that I talk about the sort of internal, motivation being internal, and there are those internal voices that are talking to us a lot of the time as well, influenced by the external environment. So that focus that you had initially from a military point of view, and then being a little bit wider as we move forward, is an interesting one in terms of how we change throughout careers and we mature in terms of our thought processes and all of those sort of things. So when you spoke about wanted to be maverick going into the RAF and that side of things, when you got in there, it'd be really interesting just to understand a little bit more about that sort of military view of motivation, because I'm sure my view of that and other people's may be different if we've not been in it ourselves. So, motivation, is that something that was spoken about in the RAF, or what did that look like?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I think it's one of those things that it's very much assumed, when you go through the selection process, they only recruit highly motivated people.
Yeah.
And I think also you get this idea early on that there's a right kind of motivation. And I'm not sure now. I have the confidence to go, I don't think it really matters as long as you're not hurting people. Because if I'm really honest, was I motivated to serve the Queen and country as it was back in the day? And that's what I said in my interviews. No, I was 16. I wanted to wear a cool flying suit and a jacket with badges on, and I wanted to be able to brag about being a pilot. So basically, I wanted to be cool, and that was my motivation. But you never said that out loud. So I think there's an interesting idea about how much pressure do we put on ourselves to have the right kind of motivation, and does that really matter? Because I think then when I joined the Air Force and I did all this flying, you sort of feel like, well, I should be loving every minute of this because I'm doing my dream job. But flying's really hard work, and you spend a lot of time, not thinking that you're very good. And these days we'd call that imposter syndrome, but back then you just called it the fear. So you kind of get to that moment, you think, well, I'm not enjoying myself as much as I feel I should be. So now I feel really bad, but I could never say that, because then that would say that I'm not motivated for the right reasons, or so on and so forth. So I think it's a really, sort of motivation can be a really enabling thing, but it can also almost hold you back if you sort of feel shame around it. And that it's again why it's such a fascinating subject to talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. That's an interesting one that you refer to the fear. I like that. I like that terminology. Yeah, imposter syndrome, the fear. Yeah, that is internal pieces again talking away and saying, yeah, you're not good enough. How do you approach that then? If you're sat in charge of quite an expensive bit of kit, and you're thinking to yourself, hang on a second, I don't think I'm quite as good as I thought I was.
Yeah.
How do you approach that side of things? Because presumably that could make you run away pretty quickly.
Yes. So I think a couple of things that I learned sort of by accident, or, just by sort of getting on and doing it, is the first thing is people are quite resilient in the military. You do just sort of get on with it, right? And I do think, I don't quite know how we manage it, but maybe it's because from the word go, you're kind of cold and wet and hungry, and you just get used to being uncomfortable. And this is why I now think that being able to be uncomfortable, and not necessarily being comfortable being uncomfortable, but being confident being uncomfortable, is so key for resilience. And I think that's something that you just did in the military. So I think that does help you to sort of deal with the fear. But I think also, banter, humor, making light of it, because I think it's really easy to lose perspective. And one of the things that I know now that I didn't know back then, because I studied mindfulness, is what I refer to as distress tolerance. But basically, it just means an ability to sit with difficult thoughts or difficult feelings and not judge them, because there's a temptation, if you've got the fear or you're feeling uncomfortable, to assume that you're getting it wrong somehow, that you're flawed, or like, maybe I'm not a very good pilot because I feel a bit scared of, failure. And you assume that you're the only one feeling like that. And that also, sorry, pardon me, because you feel that fear, somehow that means that you're not motivated enough, or there's something wrong with you. But I think when you realize that A, everybody's going through it, and B, it's just a feeling, and you can actually just sit with that feeling, then it no longer, sorry, you might have to edit that one out.
That's fine.
You no longer, pardon me. Yeah, you no longer have to be held back by it. So that's what I think it would have been helpful to know back then. That ability to sit with difficult feelings. And that really now comes under the banner of emotional intelligence, and it's stuff that we understand better than, I don't know about you, but when I went through school, we didn't know any of this stuff. We weren't taught any of this stuff. Whereas now we're being taught, the kids are being taught this stuff a bit more. So I think that will help to stay motivated and realizing that just because it's hard isn't a reason to become demotivated.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one, isn't it? The challenges are there. It's how you then you're dealing with that challenge, your thought processes that go through it, and everybody's going through similar things. Yeah, and I think it's a key one from a motivational point of view as well, is that there is that expectation that you should be full of energy, you should be highly motivated, and all of those things. And actually, fluctuations in motivation are perfectly normal. You can't.
Yes.
Can you imagine being on it all the time? Flipping heck,
yes.
you wouldn't last. And also, I don't think there's many people that would put up with it as well. There's that sort of, Duracell bunny type sort of situation where you're like, oh, for goodness sake, just calm down a little bit, will you? So that motivation piece is interesting from that perspective. So there is that, and you mentioned resilience there. Now, in these next questions, I'm no way suggesting that you weren't a very good pilot, but you mentioned crashing. Slightly interesting one. It was a crash. Can you have an okay crash in a helicopter because you're still here, which is good, but how did you get over that then?
Yeah, well, that's interesting because I had 2 wire strikes. I think they might have been referred to as, I think the first one was an accident, second one was an incident, but yeah, I mean, I call it a crash because I don't know, it's a more easygoing word, but anyway, funnily enough, when you fly very close to the ground in a helicopter, you do sometimes bump into things. It's not common, don't get me wrong, but also it's not that it's particularly surprising if these things happen. So how did I get over it? Well, I mean, you do just sort of get back on the horse, really, get back in the helicopter. I think when the first time I ever hit the wires, I was young, I was 24. And actually, people say, were you too scared to get back in the helicopter? I think it was the opposite. And I don't know if that's the arrogance of youth. It probably was. But I thought, well, it's obviously not my time. So I'm invincible. So it had the opposite effect. I think as maybe, it's a sort of bit of a cliche, but usually cliches are true. As you get older, you get more responsibility. When my son was born, you're a bit less gung-ho about these things. You think, oh, actually, I am made of, flesh and blood, basically, and I'm not immortal. But to start out with, I think, it's funny how you can actually see something as a sign that, actually I'm pretty tough.
Yeah. So a good way of sort of in keeping that confidence going as well. And I think the confidence within ourselves is quite an important one, particularly as you start moving and change, and change comes into play, which of course is one of those constants in life, that it is going to change at some point. So beyond being in the RAF yourself, that change was going to start to happen. Was your change out of the RAF something that you suddenly went, okay, right, I'm done now, time to move on? Or is that something that you plan or had planned for quite some time?
I think it was an evolution, and then there were some sort of mini revolutions along the way that sort of prompted me. And I remember we spoke before about this. I think there can be pull factors and there can be push factors, and I think there was a bit of both in the end. I think I was starting to get this idea that I was really interested in kind of running my own business, and I was chatting to my partner about it. And then a couple of push factors happened. I was involved in an incident, which won't go into the detail, but it kind of shook me quite emotionally. And as is often the way with these things, we don't really stop and address our skeletons until we're forced to. And so it made me kind of have a big look inside, and I realized I wasn't really a big fan of who I was. There was a lot of self-loathing in there and all that kind of stuff. And I thought, actually, this is my motivation, is like, I just want to like who I am. And I realized I didn't really like who I was. So that was then my huge motivation, was to sort of try and find some peace. And that's how I found mindfulness. And then I realized that actually a lot of people are struggling with these things. It's not just me. And, a lot of people are putting a brave face on it. And actually, I'd really like to, help people. And I was probably slightly doing it to help myself as well. You don't realize at the time, you think that you're being altruistic, but it's probably partly is your own healing journey. But that was, that a big push factor was that I realized it no longer served me to stay in the Air Force, because I had this new passion that I wanted to go and, help people kind of make peace with their brains and use their minds as a force for good, because I'd seen and I'd experienced for myself what it's like to be at war with yourself, and how, how miserable it can be, basically. So I wanted to, help people find a way out.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Fantastic. So in terms of those sort of next steps and moving on out of the RAF itself, that change in that environment and what you've got and the support within those sort of environments, did that have a big effect in terms of how you were operating when you first came out of the Royal Air Force? Or is that something that you sort of prepared because you knew it was going to be happening, that you were able to put plans in place?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, because I think I've probably got this sense of identity that I'm a bit of a lone wolf, and I'm quite self-motivated, and that's probably a bit unfair on the people that have supported me around, me and my family and very close friends. But I think I'm, quite single-minded with this stuff. So I'd probably say that certainly my impression was that I just kind of went and did it on my own. And actually that ties into, when I'm talking about resilience, a lot of the stuff I talk about is self-reliance and self-sufficiency. And that's not to say that we don't support other people, but I think if you have the confidence that you've got everything that you need to be able to get through difficult times, and I think that's a great feeling to have. So I probably felt like I was going at it alone and unafraid, although I'm sure, that was not completely true. There were people supporting me, but I think I just sort of went for it, basically.
Yeah. Just give it a go. Take a step forward. Yeah, absolutely. And so in terms of that then transition now, then, so from a day-to-day basis, and from my point of view, my business is a small business as well, going out and doing those sort of things. And I was involved in the corporate world for a long time, big pharmaceutical world. It's so different. There isn't those support mechanisms. There isn't somebody there going, oh, here's this bit of IT, here's that bit of IT, here's a car, here's where you're going next week, here's a diary full of meetings. It suddenly steps out and he goes, well, hang on a second. Where do I go? What do I do? And for me, that motivation to actual gathering energy from being on my own is quite significant, because I also like the fact that I'm with people as well, because that gives me energy, gives me motivation. Doing podcasts, that's why I do podcasts. I like to get stuff out to people so they can hear what's going on. But I love it because I get to speak to lots of different people. And when I've done these, I come off them and go, God, this is just brilliant. I can physically feel that energy have been sort of drawn in, and it's great. So when you're here, you go, Sarah, start your business, off you go. What happened? Where did your head go? What were your first steps?
I obviously did not have a clue about business. And that's the thing, in the military, you don't have much commercial sense, really, because you don't need to. So I did hire a business coach, someone who'd also been in the military and had trodden that path before me. And he kind of did a sort of set up a business by numbers with me. And in the end, I don't know if I've kept in place much of what we did when we started, but the important thing is you get started. And I think, again, coming back to the word motivate, it means movement, doesn't it? And I just think you just get started. And I know you don't want to be running around in circles, headless chicken. You want to sort of have some idea of where you're going. But I think more important than that is just take the first step. So I think getting a business coach was what gave me the confidence to take the first step. And then once you're off, then you're like, oh, okay, I'm going to change direction slightly. But I think you've kind of got to get moving to start with.
Hello, hope you're enjoying this episode. When you've finished, why not subscribe to the Motivational Mindset podcast to learn more about motivation in business and beyond. Thanks. Now, back to the podcast.
You mentioned earlier there was a little bit of a change in terms of your motivation now versus the RAF point of view. Are there key things that you've seen in yourself? I mean, you mentioned you're very much that sort of self-starter, be able to go it alone and that sort of thing. Has that continued, or have you found that that networking piece and that working with others, you found you doing more of that, or how has that worked for you?
Yeah, that's interesting. So I know a lot of people don't particularly enjoy networking, and I heard your previous podcast. I know that you said that you do. I don't like networking. I like one-to-one stuff. I like this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
I like one-to-one coaching. I like one-to-one conversations, and I love exchanging ideas and getting inspired about ideas. So I get energy from one-to-ones. I hate networking.
I'm sure a lot of people will resonate with that.
Yes,
listening.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, but part of it is, again, I heard your previous podcast about where you get energy from. And I think energy and motivation are linked. They're not quite the same thing, but obviously energy is important. And if you know you get energy from, the one-to-one kind of conversations, that's what I'll do. So I have a thing that, because I, run workshops and I get people to think about what their high energy and low energy time of day is. And, because of that, I've worked out that I'm better off having my meetings in the afternoon, because actually I get energy from having one-to-one exchanges. Whereas when I'm doing my deep work and I'm contemplating, that's when I have to have high energy. So I do that in the morning. But also I have my Friday meetings as like my fun meetings. So I'll do things like this where I just know, I'm just going to really enjoy it. So I make Friday like a really kind of fun day for me. And I think that helps me to keep my overall energy levels up. But I think that, again, I know it's not quite the same thing as motivation, but, it's part of the puzzle, isn't it?
Yeah,
so I think
absolutely. Yeah.
Knowing what energizes you to keep your overall energy levels up. And I think what that brings into play as well is that ability, that requirement to recharge. Like you say, energy does ebb and flow, motivation ebbs and flows. So what do you do to pick yourself back up? Is it just allowing yourself to stand still? Because I think that's important. Is it doing an energizing activity? But I think, managing it consciously is really important, isn't it?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And it's really interesting. You mentioned that time of day. I think that's quite a good one from a listener's point of view. When do you feel that those energy levels start to drop off? Because there is an impact on that performance that you're going to be giving. So you do need to consider that. I distinctly remember when I was in corporate land, I used to get to about 2:30, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and people would say straight away to me, "Oh, Rich, you've reached your point already then, have you?
Yeah.
You're there." And they could see it. They could see it because my attention would go. I'd be wandering off to make yet another cup of coffee or, have a chat with somebody else. So it definitely is visible in a lot of the ways. And if we can monitor that, or, there's no good or bad or different way of doing it, as you mentioned there, but it actually, it's definitely something to be aware of as we move through what we're doing, because it can have quite a significant impact on our own mood as well as others. If they're not aware of it and you're suddenly quite sort of off with them because you're losing that energy, how does that work? Physical activity, I think it's something that you probably are doing. If we're doing an audio here, but Sarah has just returned from a run straight into a podcast. So is that physical activity for you really, really important in your daily routine?
Yes, I get all of my light bulb moments when I'm either running or I'm having a one-to-one with a glass of wine with a good friend. There's where my best sort of moments come from, and best sort of light bulb ideas. So I absolutely love running, and I knew it was absolutely the right thing to do to go for a run before talking about motivation, because I'd be full of energy. And I live in Henley, so I had to run through a significant amount of water because the river's very high. But I knew I was sort of talking to myself thinking, I am now really cold and wet, but I'm still highly motivated because I love running.
Yeah, absolutely. And so is that something that you, again, different for everybody, but from your point of view, do you do that on a daily basis, or is there just sort of a couple of times a week? How does that work for you?
Yeah, so So I have a son who's 9, and the school is a mile away. So basically I run to school with him in the morning and then carry on round. So I get my run every morning, and I just feel that really, really sets me up. Also, even though I love running, that thing about motivation, for most people, it drains throughout the day. So if you don't crack those tasks that require higher levels of motivation in the morning, you're unlikely to do them in the afternoon, I find, because your motivation is low. So setting myself up for the day with a run is perfect. And I used to sort of run because I thought it was keeping me slim and fit. And of course it is. But actually, I think the main reason for me now is that it's the emotional, mental side of it. I just feel great when I've been running. Yeah. And actually, in terms of fitness, I'll do different types of activity. But running is just for me. It's just me time because I love it.
And it's interesting, actually, because several times you've mentioned that me piece. And, if you're thinking about it because your job you do now, you want to help people and all that sort of thing. And then suddenly you're going, well, yeah, but it's about me. Hang on, what are you trying to do there? Do you find that looking after you helps you to help other people? Does that make sense?
Yes, I do. Now, I think people are different. And I've had a conversation recently about this. And this chap who read my book said, I love your book, Sarah, but it's very much about me. And when are you going to write about we? And I did feel a bit kind of like, oh, gosh, I am quite inward focused and I'm quite egocentric. And I know that about me. And I know that there are other people who are much more outward facing, but I know I'm an inward facing kind of person. And I think that can be a strength. It can be a weakness. The way I make it a strength is because, and again, this is a sort of thing I got from mindfulness, is understand yourself to understand others. So, for example, I know I worry about not being likable, and I know that I'm scared of being rejected. And, for a while, I thought I was the only person in the world who felt like that. But when I started talking about it, so when I give these talks, I talk about that. And on the face of it, it sounds quite selfish because I'm just telling my story. But there are lots of people in the audience going, that's me too. So that's why, that's kind of how I think I am helping other people. And yes, I am talking about myself, but I'm giving other people permission to recognize themselves in my story. And that's, kind of how I frame it. Other people might say, no, Sarah, you're just talking about yourself, but that's hopefully not what's happening.
And that's really interesting from a motivational point in itself, because when we talk about ourselves or we do that sort of things, the internal focus things, because it does provide us with some motivation as well. Looking after ourselves puts us in a better position to be able to look after others and do the right thing. Because if we're not in a good state of mindfulness or motivation or well-being, whatever you want to call it, then we don't perform at the level that actually enables us to help other people as well. So that idea of looking after number one is a good one. And I think we're coming back to it quite significantly, quite a lot, to say you've got to be in the right place, otherwise what you do isn't going to be effective or the right levels for you. So actually being internally focused and looking after yourself is actually a good place to be in, because it can enable us to do others.
Yeah, and I think there's a couple of things. It is looking after number one, but I think it's understanding yourself, because the human business really is about understanding people. Selling is about understanding people. Leadership is about understanding people. Now, you're not a mind reader, but you've got a mind of your own that you can explore and become aware of. And although we're all wonderfully unique, we're also all human. So I do think we have a tremendous resource, which is our own brains, our own minds, to understand other people and have more compassion for them, more empathy, and be more intuitive. Because I also think one of the things that really motivates us, which we haven't talked about yet, is fear. And actually, if you can tap into what you're scared of, you're not a million miles from understanding what other people are scared of. And then you can actually, if you can take away some of that fear for them, or, even just acknowledge it, then actually you can be quite intuitive. So I think it's more than just looking after yourself. It's understanding yourself to understand others. But I think the other thing is, if you don't look after yourself, it will come out in other ways, and you won't be there for people in the way you want to be. For me, I'll be more prickly, or I'll end up, my agenda will be more self-serving because I'm not looking after myself. So I'm, end up being more selfish anyway. So it is a sort of counterintuitive thing, but I do think that starting from within with an intention of radiating that outwards, that for me is what I have found works for me.
fear again. Go back to that fear word. I'm intrigued. So, fear as a motivator or a motivation. How does that work? Surely we just want to run away from those things, don't we? We want to get away from them and say, right, okay, that's not a problem. I'll do the things I really like. That motivates me. So how does that work? I've got more of an idea that from a military point of view, the fear thing might be, it's a somewhat of a different level than the majority of people, I think. How does that work for you? Or what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think you can be motivated away from something, and again, I know we have this idea, that's the wrong way round, but it happens, like we work hard because we're scared of being poor, or we dress nice because we don't want to be rejected or whatever it is. So fear is a really, really strong motivator. And again, through kind of mindfulness and learning with, to sit with my own fears, I realized that your instinctive response is to run away from it, but you can learn to turn towards it. And often I'm guided by, if it's a bit scary, it might just be exactly the right thing to do. Like standing up on a stage and talking about rejection. It's not a sexy subject, and I'm a bit scared doing it. But then I think maybe that's exactly why I need to talk about it, because if I'm scared of talking about it, so is everyone else. And maybe someone in the audience needs to hear me talk about this. So actually, I think, it's a kind of a feel the fear and do it anyway kind of thing. But I think it's starts out as a motivation away, but you can train yourself to turn towards it.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And that sounds like is that the sort of thing that you've done with your public speaking? Because you mentioned, you like your one-to-ones and, having that sort of conversation, that's motivating for you. And then, here we go and stand in front of 500 people then, Sarah. It does seem a bit counterintuitive, but just do it, take a step and see what happens. Is that how you go about that?
Yeah, it is. And actually, funnily enough, public speaking is it's a weird one, because you think, that's being in a room with hundreds of people. Yes, it is, but you're really just having a conversation. You're kind of having a conversation with yourself in a way. So it's actually the ultimate inward reflection. Now, obviously, if you're hopefully a good speaker, you're going to be resonating with the audience, connecting with the audience, eye contact, all that kind of stuff. But you're very much controlling the narrative. It's not like a one-to-one. People often say, you're really vulnerable when you're on stage because you're sharing all these things. But I'm deciding what I'm sharing. So actually, it's quite one way speaking. And in some ways, that makes it less scary because I'm completely in control of what I'm saying. The question and answer session, that's much more scary because you don't know what people are going to ask.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that works really nicely. A lot of people say, from a presentation point of view, it's the worst thing. I would never do it. You wouldn't catch me doing that sort of thing. It is great. But yeah, flip it round. It's your topic. The words coming out of your mouth, you're deciding what to say. And you can control where that conversation goes. Or it's not even a conversation, is it? It's just that, that narrative, that story that flows through. That sounds like a pretty good top tip, if you ask me, from that point of view. which takes us on to our next part of our conversation here, because we've covered a lot of ground there. I think, in terms of that and the military, moving on into your own business side of things. So we have mentioned a lot. If there's one thing that you'd like to impart to our listeners, and I know there's always lots of things, but what's the one thing at the moment? Because it can change, it obviously changes. What's the one thing that you think people can take away from the conversation we've had here today?
Yes, it is a difficult question to answer. And I'm not going to say there's one thing, but I think my starting point would be, if you sort of don't know what your motivation is, and also I think we feel a lot of obligation to know what our motivation is and to have the right motivation. And I think if I was, I think it's easy to overthink that. And I think we need to be able to sort of trust our own gut instinct and be guided by what intrinsically motivates us. And I would start by asking myself, who do I want to be? I think that's where I'd start. And I like that because it's who do I want to be in the present, but also who do I want to be in the future. So if you are future orientated, that's fine. But if you're in the present, that's fine too. So I would just start by asking myself, who do I want to be? And let that, and then start moving towards that, whatever it is that you need to do.
Fantastic. So there's the homework for everybody listening. Who do you want to be? We got 500 words written down and sent through. Have a think about it and see where do you want to be? Who do you want to be moving forward? Thank you. That's great. So, as we do move on towards the end of our little chat here, you mentioned a book that you've written. That would be great just to share with the listeners again. What's your book about? What you mentioned your career and about yourself. If you just give us a quick sort of summary of that, that'd be fantastic. Let them know where they can get it from as well.
That was good product placement, wasn't it? It's called Fly Higher. Train your mind to feel as strong as you look. So it is really a mindfulness book. If you wanted to work with me as a coachee, this is the sort of stuff that I would be working through with you. 7 chapters, and it really is my way to train your mind using mindfulness techniques. It's illustrated and punctuated with stories of daring do, just to sort of keep it. So it's designed to be entertaining as well. So you will get some flying stories in there, but it is self-help, so personal development book, and it's about self-leadership really. So it is about looking inwards and feeling strong so that you can go out there and be strong. So that's the book's available on Amazon and all good bookstores, I think is what they say.
Fantastic.
And also, sorry, beg your pardon. It is on Spotify, so I know some people will be listening to it on Spotify. So actually, if you want to hear me narrate it, which I think would sound awful, but if you want to, it is available on Audible and it is available on Spotify.
Brilliant. Oh no, good. Always like, hey, podcasts, audiobooks, it's the way to go, It's the way to go, definitely. And from working with you directly, do you have a website that the people can go in and look on in terms
I do, yes. So for the public speaking side of things, it's sarahfurness.com. And if it's more coaching or workshop, then it's Well Be It Coach.
Well Be It Coach. Fantastic.
Yes, .com.
Okay. Great.
Yes.
It's been a pleasure to speak to you, Sarah. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you.
This was a Switch Motivation production from Switch Performance Limited. Music by Dennis Kischuk from Pixabay, the Motivational Mindset Podcast. Download, listen, subscribe